Three Bad Men by John Ford. Well, actually, what we're going to do here, we've sped up the film again. It's in the public domain. I'm allowed to do that here. And so, as a result, I just kind of want it, again, to be a demonstration of when you see it all play out so rapidly, you can gauge almost easier, strangely enough, just how fluid and what a beautiful sense of coherence and continuity, spatial aesthetic, which Ford had in regard to these films. And it's important to remember the silent era was so intrinsically visual compared to the sort of the flat dialogue scenes, the sort of theater adaptations of the earlier part of the 1930s in Hollywood. There were exceptions, but by and large, your average silent film had a lot more visual splendor than your average early talkie, for sure. There's no doubt about that. Ford, apparently, I'm not sure if this is the case during this point of his career, although, so they say, by the time he was an established director at this time, but say during the perhaps 40s onward, Ford had a very strong idea of how he wanted the film to look. It was known that he could undertake often extensive and uncredited rewrites upon the films, and so the finished product would still be celebrated for having the credited screenwriter's work, and that screenwriter would be given any appropriate accolades that they might receive or be nominated for, though Ford's had written the text in some cases. This has been pointed out in regard to the 1947 film of The Fugitive, although there are those who claim that this occurred far more frequently in where Ford's films are concerned. And Ford was a successful enough filmmaker, an influential enough filmmaker, where he could really get away with that sort of thing, or / people wouldn't question it, let's say. Now, Ford would direct his films in sequence. He would try to as much as possible. He wouldn't film sort of establishing. He had an idea of how he wanted the scene to be shot, and he wouldn't shoot master shots that he felt weren't going to be used in the final film. Ford's intent was to allow as little room for the editors, even if they were kind of ordered to by the studio execs, who he hated with quite a passion. Good for him. He wanted them to have as little material with which to puncture or alter the film his vision as much as possible. He wanted to give them as little room to do that as he could. And when all they could do was potentially cut up the film to make it potentially more streamlined and maybe less coherent as a result, there was not much they could do. They didn't have much choice. It certainly would have helped that Ford, his films resonated with audiences time and again. In fact, his brand of entertainment wound up influencing a hell of a lot of other films. And so as a result, it can be said that he, whatever Ford's vision was, he seemed to just tap into something that resonated with not only millions of Americans, but worldwide. You hear about the Western genre, or I do, having a great popularity in Australia. Actually, some claim that the first Western novels, as we understand it, like the genre, are Australian Westerns, and that the American Westerns novels were published after some of the early Australian texts, and some of those famous American Western tales were published or written by a German man, Karl May, who never left Germany, which is interesting to think about. But, the point I'm making is, it was a genre that resonated not just in Australia. I mean, we have a similar-ish story to the United States and similar landscape in respect. So it makes sense that their take on the genre and, their film industry far more financed than ours, for instance, would take off. Although, what is fascinating to me is how worldwide, all across the globe, these Western films, these cowboy films, John Wayne, very popular. Now we think of John Wayne as sort of the target of anti-imperialist tirades, perhaps rightfully so, in some respects. But when isn't it just really intrinsically interesting how much these stories resonated with people. And the reason is because they're rooted, I think, the Western genre at large, arguably, but certainly Ford's take on it, which defines our understanding of the Western. Ford had a very Christian, or certainly very Catholic, take on the Old West. A very biblical, I guess we could say, take on the potential of these kind of stories. As I've pointed out before, much of the action in the biblical texts are in a desert location, wide expanse, blank canvas for the crises of the human conscious.